you so much, Beta. My name is Cohort, and I am the director of the Interfaith Leadership Institute at Interfaith Youth Core. And I'll talk more about what that is if you're unfamiliar with us in a second. But I have the distinct privilege today of being able to host and be the moderator for a conversation that we'll be having about how interfaith work connects with change making, which I think is especially important in today's time. And I'm so glad that we have two wonderful guests talk to us both about how they as individuals and about how the institutions they work at are thinking about interfaith leadership, thinking about change making, and thinking about the connections between those two areas. I'll introduce Katrina and Hans in just a second. But first, I'm going to share my screen here so I can pull up the presentations. 1 second. So just to reiterate again, my name is Cohort. I work at IFYC in Chicago. I'll talk a little bit more about what that is in just a second. I'm joined today by Dr. Hans Gustafsson, who is a professor at the University of St. Thomas and also the director of their J. Phillips Center for Interfaith Learning. So he's I know we're all virtual, but he's a hometown boy in this instance. And then also our other guest is the Reverend Katrina Jenkins. She's the Dean of Religious and Spiritual Life at Rollins College. And we all agreed beforehand that she is the luckiest of all of us because she's down in Orlando, Florida at this moment and not in Chicago or Minneapolis or St. Paul, where at least for me in Chicago, it was snowing until about an hour ago. So Katrina has been kind enough to put as her backgrounds the beautiful chapel they have there on campus, and it looks very nice and tropical.
Thank you.
So we will jump into our conversation with them in just a second. But before we do that, I wanted to take some time to talk about how I relate to this conversation. So I work at a place, IFYC, and we are a national nonprofit that, as you can see on the slide there, is working towards an America where people of different faiths, worldviews, and traditions can bridge differences and find common values to build a shared life together. An even shorter version of that I tell people is that we promote interfaith cooperation in our civic life here in America. And by doing that, we focus on colleges and universities, American colleges and universities, and the work that they're doing. And this is a little nice picture. This is actually in our office in Chicago, since we can't be there right now. I thought I would show you this. But we work with colleges and universities to promote that interfaith work for a lot of reasons, some of which I'll talk about in just a second. But I thought it would be helpful before we dive too deep into our conversation to lay out some of how we think about interfaith cooperation, how we think about interfaith engagement. And so to do that though, I want to step back and talk about pluralism. Pluralism for us is what we're hoping to achieve in our work, civic pluralism. If you look on the left-hand side of this graphic that I put up here, it kind of talks about what pluralism is to us. And a lot of our definition of pluralism comes from the Harvard scholar Diana Eck. I'm sure many of you are familiar with her. She's a world famous religion scholar. And she talks about in a lot of her writing about religious diversity here in the United States that diversity in and of itself is a descriptor, right? It's actually neither positive nor negative. You can be in a place with a lot of diversity and people are getting along. You can be in a place with a lot of diversity and people can be at each other's throats or attacking each other. And that's the same whether it's a community, whether it's a state, whether it's a country, whether it's a world. So we don't see just the fact that maybe your campus is diverse or that your community is diverse as a positive or a negative. It's how you engage that diversity that is important to us. And so we are hoping to achieve pluralism, not just diversity, but pluralism. And that's the active engagement of that diversity towards a positive end. So for us, when we talk about change making or leadership, we're thinking about how can people actively engage the diversity on their campuses or in their community towards a positive end so that they achieve pluralism, right? That, as you can, I think you can kind of see there's a little arrow there pointing from the pluralism part to how you achieve that. And we think that you can achieve pluralism by focusing on three parts. One is respect. So that's respect for religious and non-religious identities. So how, I'm going to use a lot of campus examples here, but you can also think of this more community-wide as well. But for instance, respect on a campus would look like, are there policies that talk about religious diversity and that show an indication that it matters on campus? So you can think about, does your holiday absence policy for students related to exams, is it inclusive of students from various traditions? That could be, that's one very concrete, very small example of that. You can also think of respect in less tangible ways. So is the climate on your campus, the rhetoric that administrators or faculty or staff use, the feelings that students have towards each other, did they showcase levels of respect for religious and non-religious identities? So you can think of it in both tangible and intangible ways. The second piece that we think is important to achieving religious pluralism is relationships, particularly ones that are mutually inspiring. So again, to use a campus example, if you think about, say, student affairs staff, how are you in student affairs? Well, let's even narrow it down even more so, like how are you in residence life, a place where students are living and breathing right outside of the classroom? How are you as a staff member promoting mutually inspired relationships in residence life situations between students who might come from very different backgrounds? You can also think about this as if you are an advisor of a student group. How are you building relationships within an interfaith group, or even within a group that's not explicitly interfaith, but that nonetheless has a diversity of viewpoints in there? So that would be a tangible example of what relationships look like. The third piece that we focus on is promoting common action for the common good. So how are you encouraging students, staff, faculty to both identify what is the common good on their campus? Sometimes that can be most of the issue, and then also act upon that. So again, for a very simple example, maybe like I once worked with a campus where there was a river that flowed through the main body of the campus. It was a very dirty river at the time. So one of the issues that their interfaith group came together around was saying, how can we clean up this river that affects all of us in or around the campus community? And while at the same time that we're doing that, which is obviously a benefit in and of itself, we're also thinking about what brings us from our own worldview, from our own different backgrounds to do this type of work. So what as a Jewish student brings me to do this type of environmental cleanup, or to work with somebody who is not Jewish? Again, just that's a total hypothetical in this case, but I think you get what I'm saying. So those are the three levers that at IFYC we focus on, which is respect, relationships, and common action. I should say, although I presented them in that order, one of the things we like to emphasize to groups is that sometimes maybe your interfaith work starts in the relationships bucket and then builds out to the respect and the common action. Maybe it starts in the common action. You have a really robust service learning program on your campus. But what you need to think more about is how are you building relationships amongst students in that service learning program around their different worldviews. So I presented them in a 1, 2, 3 way, but I want to emphasize that you can come at these in a lot of different aspects on your campus. And once you start to see positive results in these three categories and in this area of work, you're starting to achieve pluralism. I wish I could say that if you do 100% in all of these areas, then you have achieved pluralism and you're done on campus. But civic pluralism is one of those things that is an ever-evolving and ever-growing goal. So there's no endpoint, right? This is something to just think about as you develop your programs. How are you integrating these aspects into all of them? If you have achieved 100% civic pluralism, please speak up, and I'll hand you over the platform right now, and you can speak. But again, to emphasize, these are inspirational goals for all of us. Okay, oops, that's a spoiler alert there. With all that being said, I want to emphasize two other points, and then we'll get started with the actual interesting part of this whole presentation, which is the interview with our two guests here. Two things that I wanted to highlight for folks, and this will actually be a good transition to our first question. A lot of what we've been seeing at IFYC in the past few years, in terms of the broad swath of higher education, since we do work with all types of colleges and universities, from public institutions that are very large to private, religiously affiliated institutions that can be smaller, so all those in between. Some of the common trends that we've been seeing in recent years are the importance of campus climate in terms of promoting interfaith engagement on a campus. And campus climate, if you were in, I recognize some of you might have been in my colleague Mary Ellen's session earlier this morning. She talked a little bit about that. But essentially, what are the policies, the structures, the programs on your campus that promote a campus climate that make students want to engage in interfaith engagement? Sometimes we like to think that students will just, oh, we have a diverse campus. Students will be talking to people who are very different than them. Sometimes that happens, but more often than not, you need to set up as staff or faculty or administrators a campus climate that encourages interfaith engagement amongst students. And I should say amongst staff and faculty and administrators as well, but especially among students, because it will not just happen, or at least it won't happen in a robust and sustained way unless you have a campus climate that supports that. And we've been getting a lot of information on that from our ideals research study that we've been doing the past 4 to 5 years. We've also been getting a lot of information on that just from specific examples from campuses that we work with, and I might share a few of those later in our conversation. So that's one thing I've been seeing, the importance of campus climate, and why I'm so excited actually to have our guests here today, because I know on both of their campuses they've been thinking a lot about these issues. And then the other issue that's become more and more apparent to us as being important is the value of interfaith friendships, those type of student friendships that go across worldviews. So a Jewish student and a Hindu student, an atheist student and a Muslim student, a Christian student and a Sikh student, and then mix those all up as well, right? So we've seen that interfaith friendships are a special factor above and beyond many other considerations on campus in terms of promoting interfaith leadership development amongst students, and in terms of promoting those healthy campus climates that I just mentioned. And what I'm going to do in just a second, I'll put in the chat box our most recent ideals report. And I should say, for those of you that don't know, ideals is a longitudinal 4 or 5 year study that we did with some great researchers in the field to identify some key factors around interfaith learning, interfaith development, and campus climate around religious diversity. And our most recent report was about the value of interfaith friendships amongst students and what they can bring both to the individual students and to larger identity groups on campus. Because one of the interesting things that the report identified was that students that have a friendship with someone from a different worldview, there are specific groups that not only do they have that friendship with someone different, but they have a more positive outlook on that group as a whole, that that person either consciously or unconsciously might represent to them, which has been really interesting to see. And the report goes into much more detail about what those groups are and what that looks like. So I'll share that with you in the chat. Okay. I've talked way too much so far, so I'm so excited to pull up my questions here. I'm so excited to be able to kick off the conversation with our two guests. And Hans, I think I'll aim this first question at you, and then maybe Katrina, you can take a stab at it after that. But hearing everything that I just said, and I know that you've been involved in this work for a long time as well, we at IFYC are often thinking about cultivating the skills, attributes, and vision of interfaith leaders throughout the country and throughout higher education. But you two are actually interfaith leaders yourself. So let's start with your own journey, Hans, as an interfaith leader. What led you to this work, and what do you see as defining attributes of interfaith leadership?
Okay, thank you. Everyone can hear me okay, I assume. Well, thank you, Car. It's great to be here. Thanks to everyone for tuning in today. I look forward to listening and conversing and learning, as I already have learned a lot from Car's presentation. I'm honored to co-present with Katrina and Car. I look forward to learning. I've learned a lot over the years working with IFYC, and if you haven't heard of IFYC, I suggest you check them out. You know, before I get to the question, I'll put a plug in here for IFYC. They really have the privilege of seeing multiple institutions, at least across the United States, and they're able to see a lot, to learn a lot, and then to share a lot. So we gain from that experience. So thank you for the work that they do. Okay, so to the question. So for a long time, I guess I never really thought of myself as an interfaith leader. And sometimes I would kind of deflect that label. Even though the work that I do in the community, I work with interfaith organizations, I teach courses on interfaith leadership. But over time, I've come to realize that this isn't a label that I should shun. I should welcome this. There's this attitude that can sometimes exist among us scholars of religion, and I don't want to denigrate this attitude because I think it can be a useful attitude, useful distinction, at least for many people. And the distinction here is the distinction between, I suppose, on the one hand, the scholar of religion, the one who studies religion or interreligious relations. And then there are the practitioners, right? Those who engage in dialogue, who are in the trenches doing peace building, promoting understanding. And this can be a useful distinction, I think, to a certain degree. It can be helpful, but at some point, at least for many of us, this distinction dissolves. So again, it's this distinction between, let's say, the scholar and the practitioner. Because in reality, many scholars are practitioners, right? And many practitioners are scholars. I suppose there are some scholars who are not practitioners. Maybe what I mean by that is they don't actively seek out interfaith engagement opportunities, and that's fine. We certainly need external critics. I see those folks who do that as assets and friends to help us along the way. But I would argue that most scholars of religion or theological studies certainly do promote a deeper understanding of a deeper public understanding of religious identities, religious communities, religious traditions. So I suppose in this way, scholars of religion are very, very much leaders. They help us, or they lead in this quest to increase the public religious literacy or interreligious literacy, which can certainly lead to a greater appreciative knowledge of other religions. And this is kind of a hallmark of CAR's organization, IFYC, and their founder, Ibu Patel, who speaks a lot about cultivating an appreciative knowledge of other traditions. So my personal journey to the question, I've come to accept that a critical approach to interreligious studies like I teach, or interfaith relations, certainly does. At the end of the day, it does promote interfaith understanding, or it can at least. So as myself, one who primarily identifies as a scholar of religion, I've come to embrace and now welcome this label of interfaith leader. And I would encourage my fellow scholars of religion that even though they may not always see themselves as so-called interfaith leaders, it's still quite likely that the rest of the world will, or certainly those on their campus will. If you're teaching about, you're studying, you're producing scholarship about religion and interreligious studies, you are certainly a leader. You will be seen that way, and you have a lot to offer. So let me just give you one more minute just to say something about you know, this model that has inspired me and the way I understand my role now as an interfaith leader, my role at my institution. And this has really helped me along my journey embrace this role. And it came about when, you know, when we look to other academic disciplines outside of my discipline, that is, when I look at other professional fields for models, especially the healthcare fields or education, clinical psychology, I get inspired. And this isn't a unique insight. Many folks will talk about this model of the scholar practitioner or the research practitioner, the scientist physician, the scientist clinician. There's a lot of language for it. And you know, I understand it's becoming less unusual for medical professionals to go into PhD, MD research/practice programs. In fields like pastoral and chaplaincy and theological fields like Katrina, perhaps, the scholar practitioner is maybe the norm. So why not for the study of religion and the critical study of interreligious relations? We might call these people scholar activists. So this is all to say, that's, you know, lately that's how I've been thinking about my role, and I've been inspired by this scholar practitioner leadership model. In terms of getting deeper into the attributes, since I am coming up on time here, I'll stop there and maybe I'll circle back if we have time later to identify some of the attributes. But I would just at this point say, looking for the ways within your current role and context to self-label, to give yourself the permission to be a leader, if we're starting to use this Ashoka language. But thank you.
Hi, everybody. Can you all hear me? Great. Greetings from Florida, and I'm so excited to be with Carr and Hans right now. In terms of my story, I fell into interfaith work. When I was in grad school, getting my master's in divinity, I decided we have a lovely thing called field education that we have to do. Most people chose to do it in churches. And I said, well, I'm here because I'm probably going to be in a church for the rest of my life. So that's not necessary. And plus I was working at a church at that point as a youth pastor. So I chose to do my field education with a social justice organization called Cooperative Metropolitan Ministries in Boston. And their thing, they were founded in the 60s in reference to Martin Luther King. There was a group of congregations that got together and said, surely we must do something better to further King's dream of having a beloved community. And so that's how it started. But I went in as an interfaith intern, which basically meant we had partnerships with different congregations all across Boston to help solve some of the issues in Boston in terms of relating to youth, in relations to poverty, many of issues that we still unfortunately see in this day. And so as an interfaith intern, we had dinner dialogue meetings where we called together various congregations and we talked about a topic. And, you know, some of those were harder than others, but we would talk about difference. We would talk about similarities, and, you know, basically that was it. And it exposed me so much to different faiths, different belief systems. I am a Christian, I'm a Baptist, that's how I'm ordained. But going into these spaces, I had to recognize that, my goodness, there's a whole big world out there faith-wise. And I had to explain so much why I believed what I did, but I got to know why other people believed what they did. And we also had what we call partnerships. So for instance, we had a synagogue and a masjid in terms of our Jewish and Muslim brothers and sisters working together on issues surrounding poverty. And, you know, in some cases that was really unheard of. So I had, you know, quite a few lessons in that. And I stayed for 2 years. I interned there for 2 years, went on to do some time, part-time with the Anti-Defamation League, ADL, which I advised. We had an interfaith group at that point, Muslims, Christians, and Jewish folk, high school students, which we would go around to different schools, different congregations, and talk about interfaith diversity, cooperation, and how do we work together. And then my first chaplaincy, I fell into an interfaith situation where I was a Protestant chaplain, and we had Muslim, Buddhist, Hindu, atheists, or secular students we had all kinds of advisors and Catholics. So I literally went and I said, okay, there's something to this. And throughout all my history, this is my 20th year of college chaplaincy, I have, my goal has been to work and create interfaith or different belief spaces for people to be able to come together, which is one of the reasons actually why I was hired at Rollins, was to start some of those, that creation. So.
Thank you, Katrina. And actually, let me aim the next question at you. So we just heard from both of you about your kind of personal development in this area, or at least your personal perspective in this. I'm also interested in hearing about how the institutions that you represent and work at, how they've been doing this work around religious diversity and interfaith engagement. So I was hoping that you could talk a little bit about the programs you work with on your campus. And since we're in a safe space here, what are the successes of those programs? And then also, what are some of the challenges that you faced with those programs? Because I think just like with any type of diversity work or any type of engagement work, you're going to face a little bit of both successes and challenges. So I'll pass that first to you, Katrina, and then Hans. And I will say, as you can go ahead and start talking as you do that, I'm going to pull up the slides because I know that you have lots of good information on there as well. But go ahead.
I'm gonna try and be brief because I know Hans has to speak, and then there are other things that we're going to try and get to. When I first came to Rollins, one of the things that actually attracted me to Rollins was the fact that they were ready to have those conversations that others weren't willing to have necessarily, other schools. So in fact, Ibu actually from IFYC came in the year before I even entered into Rollins to speak about what religious or interfaith cooperation looks like or could look like at our school. And because of that, actually, they had changed my title to be, it used to be the Dean of the Chapel, and they decided to be more intentional and make it Dean of Religious and Spiritual Life. So that was the first change. And then the president, who was relatively new at that time, decided that he wanted to have deeper, us to look deeper into what those relationships should look like. So that was one of the things. And we have this term at Rollins, I'm sure all of you have your terms, global citizenship. We are an Ashoka-based school, so we have a change-making, we even have a social entrepreneurship major where people can be in. But with that being said, so my whole thing was, first of all, to build an infrastructure. I came in and I had a Hillel group, I had a Hindu, Buddhist, Muslim group, we have an imam on campus, we have all of those things. So what I started building in terms of, we have a pagan group that we just introduced on campus, and then we're going to start a secular student alliance, or SSA, on campus, hopefully in September, if COVID doesn't take over everything, all of our plans. With that being said, I spent the first year just listening to people. So we do have the general rules and regulations in terms of, if a student, because of a faith kind of thing, needs to take off or have different accommodations, that is fine. But my goal was to expand all of that. So one of the first things I noticed was that people needed to talk. And one of the things that I started at my institution prior to coming to Rollins is a thing called table manners. The premise of table manners is that you can only talk about money, sex, politics, and religion at the table. You can't talk about the weather. You can't talk about anything. And it's very focused. So when we come in, we feed you dinner because, right, college students love food. And we feed you dinner, and we have what are called table hosts. And those table hosts consist of students who may feel comfortable talking about a topic, faculty who are point people. Like, for instance, the first one we did was on religion, politics, and money. So we had various faculty from various disciplines who were table hosts, as we called it. And so the goal was students would come in and we would give you table manners, in which there were rules of engagement in terms of speak instead of you all, to say I, this is what I believe, listen deeply in terms, so we gave several things, and we gave you things that would get you kicked out of the table, in terms of behavior, and we even had a timeout table for folks. So the first one we did 3 weeks before the election, we got about 85 people. And now we even involve community members who come in and serve as table hosts. But the first 30 minutes, we have 30 minutes in terms of the person introduces their topic, you talk about it, you have some discussions. Then I ask for people to switch to another table, and they do that, and the rounds go on. And then we have at the end, kind of like just a breakdown of, okay, this is what happened. We debrief. We spend that extra time debriefing. What did people learn? What were good things? How did they find it? And so we have found that really helpful. So we're basically on our 6th rendition of this program. We were supposed to have one in March. Really, the topic was on First Amendment rights, which was going to be quite interesting. So, you know, basically that was one of the programs that I brought, but we also have a program called We Choose Love that I came up with. And because one of the things that all faiths or beliefs, we believe, you know, most people believe in is love, right? In terms of being able to have that foundation. So what I do, I came up with the logo, and we run programming on that. For instance, when we had a young man who passed away on campus, you know, we choose love by coming together as a community. We did a labyrinth walk. We just did time where we could talk about it. We've done we choose love for different aspects. So it's a beautiful program in the sense that it can go all across the thing. We choose love by being in conversation. We've had authors of different, you know, we had an author who wrote about the Holocaust. She wrote poetry, she did stories. So those are 2 types of programs that we have done. We've done a few more. What have been the drawbacks? Well, you know, we also, and we have a multi-faith council too. I just wanted to throw that in. Last year, or the year before last, we had a situation where we had one of our evangelical groups apply to be back on campus. I won't go into the particulars. They were kicked off, violated the discrimination policy, had asked to come back onto campus. And the fury of things that have went on, our campus became polarized in very, very different ways. And it was a really tough situation to work through. The end part of the story is that we have 2 of our groups, Ivy, InterVarsity, and Crew, are on campus, back on campus. But it really spurned, first of all, there was a lot of hurt and pain because there was an uproar. There was an uproar from some of our faculty, uproar from our staff. There were 2 camps, became very polarized in those camps. Lots of emails flying around, articles in our school newspaper. I'm sure you can all imagine. And so we had to, one of my things is I saw my students being hurt on all sides. And so what I quietly did was out of the limelight, I started inviting students from different camps to dinner. I said, we're gonna go off campus. We're not gonna meet in a church or anything. We're not meeting in the chapel. We're gonna go off campus and we're gonna talk about this. I said, because right now everybody is so embroiled in these conversations. And my whole thing was, my philosophy was, if I'm going to bring on all groups, because that's part of my charge on this campus, then we have to make room, right, for those voices we may not necessarily agree with. So, you know, I took them off campus and we started just building relationships. That's my thing. I love building relationships. We started talking. We started just talking just in general. I said, everyone, share your faith experience, share your belief system. And that's what we started. That was the first layer. We went out to dinner like 2 weeks later. I was like, okay, share something else. And by the 3rd and 4th week, I was like, let's talk about what's going on campus. You know, let's share some understanding. So, you know, it was the situation lasted for about a year, and both groups are on, you know, also with some restrictions, and we're trying to make sure everyone is, you know, acting accordingly, if you want to look at it that way. But it's tough, but it also exposed to me, I said, this is an opportunity to really educate and get people talking, because Rollins, we say we graduate global citizens part of being a global citizen is not only to have an understanding of other, but to be able to work together and understand those differences. So,
yeah.
And I will shut up.
No, thank you. Thank you for sharing that. That's actually one of the things that one of the reasons why we work with colleges and universities is that emphasis, obviously on the educational component, but also on the civic component, that you want your students to go out, whether it's global citizens, whether it's, there's all different terms that institutions might use, but be able to interact in the diverse world outside of campus, right? Beyond the 4 or 5 years they might spend on a campus. What does it look like for adults to be citizens in this country or in this world? So thank you for sharing that. Hans, tell us a little bit about the work and the programs that's been going on your campus.
Sure, and thank you for the slide. There's a lot of data on that slide. I'm not going to read it and go through it, but you can get it. When my voice becomes a little boring, you can glance at the slide and learn a thing or two about our context. I'll just start with some challenges, perhaps. Maybe that's a more interesting place to start. I think one of our largest challenges, and I don't know if I doubt this is unique, building support, getting support or building buy-in, and really tailoring programs to one's culture. It's not as if, at least it's been my experience, you can't just pick up a program that works at another campus and plop it onto your campus and expect it to work seamlessly. That might, in some cases, that might very well work. I've had to often nuance and tailor programs eventually to get them to work. And we're by no means experts at St. Thomas in this. We're still very much learning. Understanding the lines of division that exist in a particular institution, that might be part of what Carr was speaking about in the beginning, about identifying, creating that culture of interfaith engagement. Sometimes there are religious lines of difference that are operating beneath the surface within a dominant or given religious group. Sometimes there are ideological lines that are operating that might be present on one campus and not another. So really getting a feel for those and knowing how to navigate those on your own particular campus, I have found crucial. So getting buy-in also across campus divisions. So I direct an academic center called the J. Phillips Center for Interfaith Learning, and we're housed in the College of Arts and Sciences. And it's really not enough just to have a J. Phillips Center on campus doing interfaith work. Now we have a fairly robust campus ministry office. There are a multi-faith campus ministry office that offers just a whole range of programs. Our student affairs and student life and now faculty are all engaged. And once this started to happen, when this interfaithy stuff started spreading across campus divisions, is really when, at least in my view, we started flourishing as a more interfaith campus. Like I said, we have a long ways to go. We have work to do. We're not where we want to be, but that keeps us striving, I suppose. We have, it sounded like Katrina has a multi-faith council. We call it an interfaith council, which formed relatively recently, a few years ago. It came out of our Office for Mission and our Student Affairs Division, which I think is important. It came out of these particular divisions and strategically made up of equally of students, staff, and faculty. Also, I'll say, listening to Katrina, I get the sense that Rollins is very lucky to have somebody like Katrina on their campus, someone who kind of goes out of their way and really is constantly getting people in a room to build bridges. We have a few of those people on campus, and they make a world of difference. Identifying where these divisions are, and then just getting them, having a meal with them. It sounds like Katrina does a lot of that. Let me shift gears a little bit and say something about institutional identity and mission. There are a lot of programs that you have up on the screen there. I'm not going to get deep into any one of them. If there's time, I might say a little something about the leadership cohort. I think it maybe ties into changemaking the most, but if there's time at the end, we can get deeper into some of these with questions. So something about identity, institutional identity and mission. Interfaith co-curricular programming or interreligious curricular programming, as Carr can attest to, are becoming certainly more trendy across, at least the United States, across the American colleges. And in my view, at least it's been my experience, that many religiously affiliated institutions tend to excel at this. There are certainly exceptions. Catholic institutions, the Lutheran institutions, some Methodist institutions here in the United States, in my experience, have flourished. They really tend to be on the front end of this trend. And I'm sure there are a number of reasons for this. Again, in my experience, you know, it's been cases where interfaith engagement or collaboration is grounded in an institution's mission, it can flourish. And that's been the case here at St. Thomas. So so we often see, you know, I hear from my colleagues at other institutions here in Minnesota and across the nation that you hear language of something like, well, here we encourage the spirit of interfaith inclusiveness and engagement, not in spite of our Catholic identity or not in spite of our Lutheran heritage, but because of our Lutheran heritage, because of our Catholic identity, right? We hear this time and time again. And I hear from colleagues at these institutions who talk about how by drawing on their mission and institutional identity, often opens doors to do this interfaith programming, both curricular in the curricular space and the co-curricular spaces. And I'd say that's certainly the case for us here at St. Thomas. We're a fairly mission-driven institution. We have several key convictions in our mission, our vision, our core convictions, our strategic plan that we can draw on. And now we have this Ashoka changemaking language that has inspired us to embed that into our interfaith culture. So all of this language has been key to getting programs up and running and building support that runs across the campus in key stakeholding areas. As I said, my slide here has several programs. The one I'll just say something about here briefly, and then we can move on, is the Interreligious Leadership Cohort, which is really, it's actually an upper division course, so students receive credit for it. It's a traditional semester-long course, which I've taken and spread it out over a course of 2 semesters. So we slow down to really get the feel for this interfaith stuff. It's for undergraduate students who are interested in engaging the local religious diversity of our region. And it's about cultivating leadership on campus and community. And it's also, I should say, it's designated as a Changemaking for the Common Good course, which is a new designation we now have that courses can apply for. There are two aspects of the program, at least 2 main aspects. And one is engagement with religious diversity, both on campus and in community. So we focus on local and, you know, hyper-local change making, I suppose. We spend the first semester really getting off campus, going into spaces of significant religious diversity, or maybe it's just of religious difference, whether it's an interfaith dialogue group in the community, or it's into a religious space that's foreign to many of our students. A lot of it's just to get into these spaces, just to listen, to observe what kind of language are these interfaith folks using, what are they talking about, what are their concerns. For many students, they didn't even know this interfaith stuff is a thing. So it's just a lot about just being present and listening. The second semester, we really shift focus to our campus. The students really know the culture of the campus quite well from a student's perspective, of course. And in the second semester, they're really charged with becoming more of a project management team, I suppose, instead of a class, and they're to create some kind of project or event or initiative that fosters interreligious understanding, either on campus or for the campus community. The second aspect of the course focuses more on personal change making. And this is a year-long, I call it the My Story assignment. Maybe that's not the best name, but it's a year-long assignment that takes places in stages where they focus on themselves. It gives them time to slow down, reflect in light of their experiences in the past, their present strengths, and weaknesses, I suppose, and then charting a future plan. And that is really about, you know, I know Ashoka has these designations of local, global, and national change making. At St. Thomas, as you can see on the slide here, we have this personal change making. So this assignment really focuses on, you know, if we're going to be change makers, we shouldn't restrict that to everybody outside of us, we should also, of course, set aside some time to cultivate change in ourselves and get our own personal house in order, I suppose. Because if we're not doing that necessary work on ourselves, it may be less likely that we'll be able to serve in the name of our strengths for others. So that's part of it. That's a smaller part of the course, but it's there, that personal change-making course. I see on this slide, we have a lot of change-making, a lot of interfaith language. A lot of this has really come up in the past, 5 to 6 years. So we are really in the process of building this culture up. Yeah, I'll stop there because I know that we don't have much time left. So I'll pass it back to Carr.
Thank you for sharing, Hans. And actually, so much of what you said resonated with some of the best practices I've seen on college campuses. I'll share a brief story because I do want to get to both. I have one more question, then I see we have some good questions in the Q&A. But a very brief story. When I first started working at IFYC, I got put on a consultancy with a college in the Chicago suburbs. It was a Catholic university in the suburbs. And one of the interesting things about that university was that about 1/3 of their student population were Muslim. And this had happened slowly over, I would say, like a 5 to 10 year period at the institution. So the institution had a lot of questions for us. And one of them was like, why? Like we're excited that we have all these Muslim students, but we don't know exactly why they're here. Like why? There's obviously something, but like we'd love to find out like what brought them to our institution. So we did some big studies and a lot of interviews and a lot of surveys with students. And after a while, one of the data points that kept coming up, especially in our surveys, and then especially in our interviews, and it was reflected also in the larger surveys, was that Muslim students were telling us that they chose this Catholic institution not because they were unaware that it was Catholic and they just happened to end up there, but because it was Catholic and because they knew that they took religion seriously, even if it wasn't their religion. And so that lit some light bulbs, both for the institution, but also for myself. And I share that story because I think it connects to your point about how you have to connect whatever change making you're doing to the mission and the heritage of your university, right? And so for this institution, they were like, oh, we're attracting students because we take our religious background seriously, even if it's not their background, right? And so that's some of where their efforts then went into, is thinking about, actually, we don't really need to downplay the religious heritage of our institution as much as we thought, because that was one of their questions going into it. Like, we want to attract a religiously diverse student body while also remaining Catholic. Do we need to kind of rear back on the Catholic stuff? And our recommendation was, no, actually, a lot of your students and a lot of your diversity is coming from the fact that you are explicit about what you believe, and that students are turning down even like public institutions in the area or other institutions that might be cheaper or might be more, might be closer to where these students live, and instead coming to your institution because you're very forthright about bringing people together around worldview. So that was just interesting to me. Obviously, you can think about it in different ways depending on the campus context. Like if you were a public institution, you might want to lean more onto, oh, we've always engaged diversity across racial, ethnic, other lines, and so we need to address it across religious lines as well. So that's not to say that every institution needs to be religious to engage it, but it is to say, thinking about what is your mission as a university, what is your heritage, and then how can it connect to your change. Okay, I got one more question, Katrina, for you and for Hans, and then we'll open it up to everyone else. And that question is very much related to the moment that we're in. And I'll be honest, I'm asking you to this because we at IFYC would love to get better at this, as I'm sure you two would too, but we are in a moment where all our relationship building, all of our acting for the common good has to be necessarily apart from each other, right? Like that's why we're all virtual right now. But for an institution like us at IFYC, it's so based on relationship building. It's so based on like cultivating and understanding of each other through relationship. I mean, you saw that was one of the pillars I mentioned earlier. We're thinking about how do we do this when we can't meet in person, when there isn't campus life to work with, at least in the same way that we thought of it for so many years. So although we're only, at least here in Illinois, only about a month into kind of this virtual existence, for lack of a better term, I'm wondering, how are you thinking about how to do the critical relationship building work, the critical common good building work during this very unique time? I'll start with you, Katrina. How are you thinking about, how are you doing your work right now?
I think this is leveraging relationships that we've had. So one of the fortunate things that we've had in religious life, we were a little bit prepared to go online because we've had online components. We use social media a lot as well, you know, from TikTok to what have you, Instagram. We had a pretty good social media kind of thing. So it was basically, we put translated all of our in-service things online. For instance, I always had a check-in with the Rev kind of day where we would do different things. They would come to the lounge at our chapel. We would do a service project. We would do ice cream. We would do something. So I moved that right online, you know, in terms of that. My Hillel group, my associate director of Jewish Life, she loves trivia. So everything that translated, you know, in person got moved to online. Same with our imam. You know, again, his Sunday school class moved online. It's not the most opportune moment, but we have taken a lot of what we have and just the relationship building, because the way that I worked it, I had already challenged my students. We have student retreat in the fall and a student retreat in the spring. So my challenges to all the student groups is that they always had to work with someone within religious life and then do programming with someone outside of religious life. So a lot of those relationships were already built across the lines. So it's always interesting. Like, for instance, we had Shabbat pretty much every Friday. We had a lot of non-Jewish folks coming to Shabbat as well. So those relationships started, you know, really getting built. We had a Muslim Christianity study built because the students would come to our lounge. First, it was like basically hanging out. Then it was like, wait a minute, why do you believe what you believe? So a lot of what we've had has gone online. I always did like a prayer group, and I call it prayers of the people. So we would, you know, it's basically anyone could come in, you could read a poem, you could do a prayer and what have you, kind of like what I called a belief or interfaith or what have you. And so that went online. So a lot of our things went online, and because of the relationships we have built, I would like to think, you know, we have meditation and we also have a mindfulness thing online as well. I'm a labyrinth facilitator. So it's kind of like de-stress. We did a lot of these programs beforehand, and a lot of people are trusting us to translate that over. And I've even started things for our faculty and staff, which I wasn't able to do as much for my faculty and staff as I have before. I think because we have done a lot of collaboration, you know, I'm in student affairs. So one of my advantages would be we were doing programs with health and wellness. So we do collaborative things with them now online in terms of let's check in. How are you doing spiritually? I was doing what I call a spiritual direction group. So again, a lot of things that we have carry over, and because of the partnerships that we, you know, I had to get the trust of my faculty that I wasn't here to necessarily browbeat people, religion and spirituality. And because of those things, they come to me and say, hey, you know, can you help us out here with something online? And we, you know, we do check-ins with the students. We've done fun things like trivia night. You know, so our students, I've been blessed. I've been able to move things and do check-ins and make sure people are okay. And I collaborate a lot with my folks within student affairs, a lot with my faculty. So that's what's helped us survive a lot of this.
Thank you. Yeah, I think that critical point about previous relationships is right on. And obviously, you can't replicate that if you didn't already have it. So it sounds like you've done a great job of cultivating that before this moment and then able to transition a little more, I'm sure not completely seamlessly, but a little more seamlessly than you would have otherwise. Hans, what about you? And what about your institution? And then you want to share a few things, and then I'm also recognizing we're almost at 2:15, so you can also share any concluding thoughts that you might have as we do that.
Yeah, I was going to say, given the time, I'm happy to yield the 2 or 3 minutes that are left to any questions. I don't have too much to add to what Katrina's wisdom there. So if there are any pressing questions, let's take one. I don't know how much time we have. We have 2 minutes. We can take 1 or 2 of those. Does that sound okay?
I saw that Robert had a question earlier. I'm going to pull that up. He said, Katrina or others, could you say more about how you prepare students for challenging conversation? What work is done in advance of learning programs to build their capacity for difficult engagements, and then any resources?
It's a very slow process, I'm going to be honest. When I first came, I did a lot of listening and seeing what faculty, staff, and students wanted. So I had a year, right, to do that. I had a president who really believed in that. And then it was the relationship building. So I show up at everything the students would have just to earn that trust. I love sports. I would show up with their things. Faculty, I asked them if they wanted me to ever speak about things about faith or what have you, or different cult discussions. I was a communications major, so the communications department took me up on how do we have difficult discussions. Athletics, same thing. I'm a mediator. I was trained as a mediator and did so in the Boston court system for 2 years. So I offered my services. So athletics came on, in terms of they saw me coming to games. Hey, can you come in and mediate? And then I started gaining the trust of the students. Now, all my students believe in what we're doing in terms of bringing together various faith groups. But with the council now, that has been really helpful in terms of from the conversations I told you all about, like happening in our lounge of all places, when they finally realized that we're not going to, that we're people too. My associate director Hillel and I are in the chapel together, which is interesting. And we have an interfaith room in our chapel, which has really helped bring together, and people just come there to hang out and to just be. We provide a safe space. I tell people you don't necessarily have to be a person of faith to come into our kitchen, to have a cup of coffee, to have anything, and I'm always on campus trying to present that religion can be, or spirituality, or even if you're not, don't have anything. I tell students, I talk to everybody. So just come on in. So those relationships have taken a while to build, but now what we're seeing is traction. Now we're seeing students who are interested and very hungry for something, in terms of that. So we see students now coming into our office that we never have seen before, just to say, I need to talk. And we also have student helpers. So I have what are called Bonner leaders. I don't know if you guys know about Bonners. It's a national program in terms of kind of like Ashoka, just on a different, another level. But we have now students who are resident hall advisors who have to, first of all, do programming. So we get programming in that way. Our Bonner leaders now focus on spirituality. We have health and wellness ambassadors that now are tied to my chapel. So it's just kind of spreading the wheel. And we do the 9 dimensions of health. So it's just basically, being a presence on campus. Like I said to my president, I'll end with this, that, we want to be at the table, not just for crisis. When a crisis, when a crisis comes up, I want to be at the table from the beginning to the end, so that you just won't call on me when you need me, that I'm already here so that we can talk and prepare for anything. So. Yeah.
Hans, any final thoughts?
Oh, no, I learned so much from this. Thank you, Katrina and Carr. I appreciate it. The last thing I'll just say, looking for leadership lessons from those around you who you know really well. That's where I've learned a lot of leadership, just looking at people I've grown up with, family members, people that maybe not strike you as leaders. So we all have some pretty close relationships, and we can learn a lot from those around us. We don't always have to look for these great historical examples, which they are there. But so yeah, that's all I'll say. Thank you for going over time, everybody. I appreciate that. I know there are other sessions that you have to get to. So thank you for choosing us today.
And feel free to email me, everybody. I see Carr put our emails up. I'm always happy to talk about the work that we're doing. So feel free. I'm available to do that. So.
Well, thank you both. Yeah, thank you both so much. And thank you all to participants for staying with us and asking such great questions. Have a great rest of the conference and a great rest of the day. Thanks everyone.
Everybody.